art can be many things. It can be incendiary. It can be inspiring. It can also be insightful, but should we be using it to glean insight about the people who made it? Hey there, folks. This was an interesting one to think about because this is an idea that I have touched on previously. I know I've brought it up in other videos and I know I've brought it up in live streams, but I want to dig into it because I had an interaction in my comments that made me go, you know what? I feel like I should actually tackle this as a isolated topic. We're going to talk about using an artist's work to infer things about that artist. So there's a phrase that I don't remember where I first heard it, and I don't know where it originates from, but the one that's been in my head for a while now that I keep in mind is, you can use the artist to read the art, but you shouldn't use the art to read the artist. So what we're going to be talking about here is the intermix and entangling of artists' beliefs, thoughts, morals, convictions, politics, and the work that they produce, and how much you should be using one to look into the other. Again, I'm stating up front, I think it is perfectly viable to use what is known about the artist to better understand the art. Doing it in the other direction is at best fraught, and in general, something I try to avoid, and we're going to get into all this. But before we do all that, we need to cover a couple things that are not what we're talking about here. Because this is not a conversation about death of the author or separate the artist from the art. It's not death of the author because death of the author has to do with your interpretations and takeaway from a piece of work. Or at least that's how I use it and how I will be using it and why it's not what I'm talking about now. Death of the author, which is something that I very much subscribe to, all that means is that when you take in a piece of work, no matter what it is, whatever your takeaways, your interpretations, your feelings about it, about what it meant to you or in general, those are yours, and they are not superseded by whatever the author had intended to be your takeaway or your feelings. The author will absolutely have their own interpretations of what everything in their work is meant to mean. However, they don't get to dictate that to you. That's why the author is dead. Your interpretation and your reading and your views and your takeaways are yours. And the author doesn't get to erase that just because your takeaways are in contradiction with or incompatible with what the author had intended the thing to mean. That's what death of the author is, and I very much subscribe to it. Separating the artist from the art, again, done a whole video on that, but I'm going to boil it down to one major reason why I don't want to entangle that with what I'm talking about today. And it does kind of have to do with semantics. I have deeper reasons for taking issue with separate the artist from the art as a concept, but the main reason we're going to avoid it is, regardless of what you will argue it does or doesn't mean, rhetorically, it is deployed by people who don't want to deal with the moral implications of them enriching and empowering bad people who make art that they like. That is how it is rhetorically used, and they're wrong to use it that way, and so I will not be engaging with it. I don't think it's actually possible to have a good faith conversation about the concept of separate the artist from the art at this point in time, which is why I'm going to be very clear, at least for my views on that concept, this we're talking about today is not that. Okay? So when it comes to the influence of an artist's personal feelings, beliefs, background, trauma, morals, politics, etc., and how they are infused into their work, let's establish something right off the bat. They absolutely are. Like, undeniably and inescapably, even if an artist tries to not infuse their own ideas, they are going to be in there regardless. It is going to be a reflection of who they are as a person, their history, what has happened to them, and what they believe. It can't be anything other than that. That will always be present, oftentimes without the artist's even full understanding of that. The shorthand that I can use from my own experience was in earlier drafts of my novel. Sure, I'll go ahead and plug it. You can get it at your local bookstore. They can get it through Ingram. You don't have to know what that means. Your local bookstore does. It's also available in audiobook. Currently still only on Audible. I do need to get it up other places. I've got a lot going on. Regardless, in an earlier draft of that, one of the editors who I had working on it pointed out to me something that I hadn't noticed, which was that I had references to stairs and none to ramps. And what that meant and implied about the setting I created was that it does not have accommodations for mobility issues. And I was really glad that that person pointed out, because while I was by no means trying to create a utopia, that was an aspect that I didn't want baked in to the world that I was creating. And it didn't occur to me, because just my own background and the fact that I myself don't have a mobility issue, I just didn't realize that my own sense of stairs are normal and, the frankly political backing and my place of privilege that results in me thinking stairs are normal. I'll talk about stairs, and then I don't think to mention ramps. That is informed by all of this. By my thoughts, my beliefs, my history, my politics, and my level of awareness of them. Because I didn't realize that I'd done that. And I did actually add references to ramps after that was pointed out to me. But again, a lot of this can be unconscious. And again, I'm going to emphasize it one more time. I am never going to claim that there is not some of the author in there. There absolutely is. And as I said at the start, you can use the author to read the text. There will be times that you will gain a much, much deeper understanding of a piece of work by understanding more about the person who created it. I think a good shorthand for that is the Chronicles of Narnia. While it is true that the Christian values and beliefs of C.S. Lewis are pretty much there from the very beginning, by the time you get to the last battle, that is a really difficult book to parse if you don't understand how all of it is allegorically Christian. Once you understand that, it makes way more sense. Without that knowledge, it's an odd piece. It's kind of an odd piece even with that knowledge. But without that knowledge, it's like, what the hell is he doing? Why are these the narrative choices? But once you know that about him, it goes, oh, okay, now I get why he did this. That is an example of using the author to read the book. But the issue with using the work, be it a book, a film, a painting, whatever else, to read the person who made it, here's the thing. While it is true that artists will always put themselves in their work, they can't avoid doing that. They will always do it. That is not the only thing that they put into their work. Yes, there will be some of them in there, but there's also going to be a bunch of other stuff. Some of it is societal cultural baggage. Some of it is just an idea that they think is neat. Some of it is tropes that they're engaging with and maybe don't even know the history of. Some of it's going to be random whims that they're just like, oh, that's a neat idea. And they just stuck it in there. And if you are using just the work and you don't have information about the author, but you are reading the work only and trying to use that to parse the actual beliefs, actual morals, actual politics of the person who made it, the problem is you can't know which of the ideas in here are the reflection of their morals or politics or religion or whatever else, and which are any of the other number of things I mentioned. You won't know what is a reflection of core philosophical beliefs, what is a narrative convenience. You can't tell that from the work alone. Now, that kind of makes my point already, but we're going to get into some examples with this. And we're going to start with the one that actually got me down this rabbit hole of thought in the first place and made me decide to do this. So there was a comment I had that referenced Zack Snyder and very casually asserted that he had right-wing views, bringing up ideas of eugenics or fascism or libertarianism or objectivism that shows up in his works. Now, this is, not a sentiment that I'm blaming the commenter for. It's one I've seen a lot, and it is a sentiment based pretty much entirely on his body of work and recurrent political themes that come up in them. The main thing that people cite in regard to that is, of course, 300, which, as a film unto itself, yeah, it's a story about a completely militarized society that is also xenophobic and ableist and misogynist. And yeah, the whole thing has kind of a fascist energy to it. While those things are definitely on display, does that mean Zack Snyder is? Any of those things? Some of them? All of them? Well, people will point to other recurrent things like how in the Dawn of the Dead, it's very much a might makes right sort of thing. And the people who express a desire for a more, peaceful just way of being, not like they're trying to negotiate with the zombies, but they are frequently killed or shown to otherwise be wrong in some manner. His interpretation of Watchmen, people will point to the way he chose to portray Rorschach as being very cool as opposed to being kind of gross and disgusting and somebody you're not supposed to like, which is much more the case in the original comics. People will absolutely point to his take on Superman and the ways in which basically there's a pretty heavy theme running through all of the times he has dealt with Superman, that this is someone who is not obligated to help humanity.
You don't know this world.
And there are absolutely some unpleasant ideas behind a lot of that. Whether it be actual fascism or whether it be objectivism, which is another thing people bring up because he has said that he really wants to do a adaptation of The Fountainhead, which was written by Ayn Rand, who came up with objectivism, which is a garbage philosophy for the record, but we're not going to get into that. So with the accumulation of all this, I will see people very casually describe him as far-right, alt-right, fascist, etc. But that's all based off his works. When you start integrating stuff from the actual man, that doesn't hold up quite so much. Because he is a self-described Democrat and actually endorsed Joe Biden in 2020. He hasn't made a lot of overtly political statements over the years, but that is one. And another thing worth pointing out, that while his work does have a tendency to appeal to some really unpleasant people, I'm not all of them, but a lot of the Restore the Snyder Cut crowd were not pleasant to encounter if you ever encountered them in the wild. But at the same time, while that might be who some of his work appeals to, he was on a charity live stream and openly denounced the channel Geeks and Gamers.
We're really not affiliated with Geeks and Gamers as far as I'm concerned. And I really just want to make that clear.
Some of the members of Geeks and Gamers were on there, and Geeks and Gamers is a very troubling channel here on YouTube. I don't want to get into it, but yeah, they're with Nerdrotic and Critical Drinker, and they're quintessential anti-wokers. That's kind of their entire bread and butter. And Snyder, knowing that some of them were on that stream, said openly, we do not affiliate. I do not affiliate. And the people running this charity thing do not affiliate with Geeks and Gamers. And he specifically called out the Asian hatred they had been leaning into around that time because, yeah, this was earlier in the pandemic where there was a lot of Asian hate stemming from the whole, China virus BS.
As the father of Asian children, it really hits close to home for me. And I just really want to put that out there that we all, there's no room for hate.
So he called it out flatly and to their faces. Oh, and let's not forget what happened with Army of the Dead, where one of his actors had allegations of sexual misconduct against him. And as soon as he found that out, Zack Snyder completely replaced him with lesbian comedian Tig Notaro. And this all happened after the movie was shot. So in a situation where many, many people would have just gone, look, it's already been filmed. I'm sorry I wouldn't have hired him if I knew. He instead committed to replacing the actor with somebody completely different. Something he definitely could have gotten away with not doing, especially given what people tend to assume about him and his audience. Now, I'm sure there are some people out there who have their opinions of Zack Snyder who are saying to me, okay, yeah, but first of all, somebody can have a couple of more liberal ideas and still be overall leaning in a direction of fascism. Democrats are not above leaning into this. I mean, have you seen some of the other nonsense that some members of the Democratic Party have said? And yeah, look, that's all true. But also, do you realize what just happened there? we went from a position of he's fascist because of these things in his works, but then when presented with things that he himself has actually said and demonstrated, they are being discarded or minimized in favor of the interpretation of his art. That's what I'm talking about. I am not saying definitively that Zack Snyder isn't any of the things that people who don't like him claim that he is. I don't know that. I don't know the man, and also I can't prove a negative. But fundamentally, I don't know any of that. But also, neither do you. You need to understand that it is completely possible for somebody to work on a piece of art, to create a piece of art that is exploring, demonstrating, and even vocalizing ideas that they themselves don't hold because they think it's artistically interesting, or they just find it energizes their creativity, or they think it's cool. Sometimes there is not a lot of thought put into it. Sometimes there is. Do you start to see we're making an automatic assumption based off of recurrent stuff in their work maybe doesn't line up? And again, hey, maybe he is all these things. But it is interesting that if he is, well, it's weird that it's more evident in his work than in anything the man himself has said. Now, Zack Snyder may have been what got me thinking about this, but I have a personal favorite example that I like to bring up when talking about this conversation. Let's talk about Robert A. Heinlein. Heinlein is a very well-regarded and renowned and popular science fiction writer from, the 60s and earlier. And he was very prolific and very influential and very important. At this point in time, he is probably best known for Starship Troopers to most audiences. Actually, let's back up. At this point in time, he is probably best known to audiences as the guy who wrote the fascist novel Starship Troopers that director Paul Verhoeven found so distasteful, the only way he was willing to do a movie adaptation of it was to ridicule the entire concept and make fun of it. That's how a lot of modern people know Robert A. Heinlein. And as a result of that, I have seen more than a few people describe this man as being fascist. Now, he's a really interesting individual to have in this particular conversation because there's a number of things going on. The first is his entire approach to sci-fi wasn't really about pushing any particular idea. His whole approach was to basically think up notions and go, okay, why don't I explore that deep enough to get a story out of it? He would come up with what-if scenarios and go, cool, let's see what I get exploring that. And those what-if scenarios weren't necessarily things that leaned into his own politics. Further complicating the matter is that his politics changed over time. In his younger days, he was more liberal-leaning. He became more conservative as he got older. That was the general trajectory. Again, understand, doesn't necessarily mean he was hard conservative on every issue by the time he died, but that was the general trajectory for him. So that complicates things. But here's what I really love to point out. Starship Troopers was not the only book he ever wrote. He wrote a number of other things, and in particular, he wrote a book called Stranger in a Strange Land. And if the pitch for Starship Troopers is, what if hypermilitarism actually worked also space bugs? And I am just going to say hypermilitarism because there's debate as to whether or not that book is actually depicting a fascist society. But Starship Troopers undeniably is a heavily militarized society. Nobody will argue with you on that. So moving on from that. If that's the pitch for Starship Troopers, then the boiled down summation for Stranger in a Strange Land is, what if Love Conquers All could actually work? Also Guy from Mars. Stranger in a Strange Land is a counterculture classic, and its themes, politics, morals, they do not lean very conservative, and they definitely don't line up with the themes, politics, and morals that are espoused in Starship Troopers. And now perhaps you're thinking, okay, but Vera, you said yourself he got more conservative as he got older. Obviously, these were written at different points in his life. Yeah, here's the thing about that. Those two books came out 2 years apart, and Stranger in a Strange Land came out later. If you look only at the works and don't look into the man's actual politics, which we do know something about, I'll circle back onto it. People who know, keep it to yourself for the moment. But if we stick to just trying to read the author from his works, these two books are irreconcilable. They do not work trying to do that at all. You have to accept the premise that if the politics and morals, etc., are reflected in the works, then one of these has to be an exercise in exploring ideas that he himself didn't hold. Because otherwise, it just doesn't work. One of these was something that he maybe actually believed, or at least some version of it. And one of these was something that was very outside of his standard beliefs, but he very much wanted to explore in a narrative, because it can't be that they both reflect his morals and philosophy. For the record, we do actually know which it was. Starship Troopers leaned more in his direction. I don't want to go so far as to say that the guy himself was as harshly militarized as that book itself is. I think it is taken a bit to an extreme for the sake of the narrative. But yeah, overall, with the guy's leanings, what politics he endorsed and or worked with, yeah, he was definitely more conservative, and the counterculture stuff in Stranger in a Strange Land was much more representative of ideas he was more than happy to explore, even though they did not connect with his own notions and morals. And we know that's the case because there's this lovely quote that I found from an article written by Kurt Vonnegut in 1990. This is the quote that he had from Heinlein. "I was not giving answers. I was trying to shake the reader loose from some preconception and induce him to think for himself along new and fresh lines. In consequence, each reader gets something different out of that book because he himself supplies the answers. It's an invitation to think, not to believe." He wasn't actually pushing the counterculture free love notions that are in the book. Although actually, while a fair amount of the counterculture stuff didn't really align with his beliefs, the free love stuff specifically did. That was something he believed in and never really let go of. So, also worth remembering, even conservative people will go in other directions on some issues that you might not expect. He was exploring them as a way to contrast with a more standard way of thinking, like, okay, whether you think this is right or not, here's some ideas to float. What about this? What about this? And a lot of it was stuff he didn't even agree with, but he found interesting to explore and write about. And that's why I love citing Heinlein in this conversation. He kind of breaks the very concept of using the works to read the author. Now, let's be clear, there can be a mix, because as I said, once you do know about his actual politics, you can parse what's going on. But if you aren't looking into that, if you don't have the information about the creator, and instead you're assuming it based off what's in their works, it doesn't really work very well. And just to be clear, none of this means you cannot call out a work for the ideas contained within it. If a piece of art or a piece of writing or a film is fascist, is racist, is transphobic, is fatphobic, is ableist, is anything else, you can absolutely call the piece of art that. Where I'm asking you to be careful is where you make an immediate leap from calling the art something to calling the artist something. The art, it's unambiguous. If the art is pushing those ideas, then the art is pushing those ideas. Whether or not that means that the creator is inherently those things is not automatic and really deserves a little bit more research. Not for benefit of the doubt reasons, but just to be sure that you are making allowances for the possibility that people either made mistakes or are exploring ideas for the art's sake, even if you think it's a bad idea to be exploring artistically. And there are some more current examples that I want to use, because up to now, I've kind of been citing examples where people will make unkind assumptions about the creators of these works, basing those assumptions off of things that come up in their works. But the thing is, it can go in the other direction too. People can assume that a work that contains morals they agree with means that the person who wrote it also holds those same values. And that is an idea that got challenged very strongly with everything that has gone on with J.K. Rowling. I know. I'm going to try and keep it as short as I can. I know. It's not fun for me either, but it actually is a really good example, because here's the thing about Rowling. I tend to cite 2020 as the point of no return in terms of having to accept the fact that she is transphobic, because 2020 was the year when she wrote that screed of an essay, basically fully outing herself on all the TERF talking points. The thing was, that was not the first indicator. People had been signaling red flags back in 2018. I myself came to the conclusion that no, she is transphobic in 2019, but I still cite 2020 because that was the point at which it was kind of undeniable. But why was it being denied before that? And even after initially, but I'll circle back to that. Well, because fans of her work, a work that, keep in mind, has fundamental core ideas of acceptance, of fighting on behalf of those weaker, of standing against people who would wipe out an entire group of folks that they consider to be somehow inferior. It is espousing fundamentally good notions. I mean, let's not forget that one of the first major pivot moments in the entire series happens in the first book, and it's when Harry has the sorting hat placed on his head, and that sorting hat sees the potential for Slytherin in him and could very easily place him there. But Harry has a desire to not be there, and the sorting hat picks that up and takes what he wants into account. And this will get reinforced by Dumbledore multiple times later on.
It is not our abilities that show what we truly are. It is our choices.
This is core to the entire series. And people couldn't reconcile that somebody that wrote a book series with that as one of its major messages could possibly be so transphobic and insisting, no, you are what you were born as, and you can never change it. It doesn't make sense if you have been reading the morals of her work and assuming that they were morals that she herself upheld and lived by. And I think this was part of the reason why even after that essay came out, some people were still kind of dragging their feet on it. There was this whole general notion that I saw. It's a lot less frequent now, but definitely early on, there was a whole notion of, okay, she doesn't understand. She's confused. She needs to be educated. We need to be kind to her. We need to explain it to her. Yeah, how'd that work out? It was never going to work. The ideas that she put forward in that essay were already solidified, but people were wanting desperately to give her benefit of the doubt because they couldn't believe that somebody could be that transphobic, but also have written something that has core messages of acceptance, finding your community, finding who you are, and being that. Because they assumed that the morals represented her actual views and beliefs and core philosophies. And it didn't. But it made it a lot harder for some people. The other thing that's interesting to bring up with Rowling is it also represents the shift that can happen, because as I noted in a video I did earlier this year, since her transphobia became inescapable, it has become much more popular to say that the books were never good and to point out the issues of anti-Semitism, racism, fat phobia, and, the fact that there is literally a slave race. The only major character who thinks they should be free is mocked for it because they are actually happy to be slaves. All of which is true, to be clear. I'm not debunking any of that. It's all true. But it's very interesting that once she has shown herself to be who she is, suddenly people are going back to the works to look for the bad politics and the bad morals that would fit with who they now see her as. And to be clear, doing it in that direction does work, because you are taking what she is saying and what she is doing and how she is behaving and applying that to the work. You're using the artist to read the art. But there are people who will do that and then go, oh, well, this always had all these problems with it. We should have realized who she was sooner. And that's a notion I take a bit more issue with. And it also means that I can touch on somebody else who I've talked more about than I would like, but I think is a really good example of what I'm talking about and how easy it is to do. And then I'm going to explain why it's a problem. But Neil Gaiman, yeah, I know. filling out all the bingo spots on this one, aren't I? So after everything that came out about him, I'm not going over it. Okay, you want the really, really, really condensed version? The man made a habit of using asymmetrical power dynamics with fans, employees, and people who are otherwise dependent on him for one reason or another in order to exploit them for his sexual gratification. The most generous possible reading of this was that he was aware of the damage he was doing but didn't care. The more negative reading is that the cruelty was the point and he actually got off on that. I don't really want to get into it any further with that. I've done multiple videos that are way too damn long. But in the wake of everything we have learned about Neil Gaiman and what he has done and how many, and I'm going to say this just because every now and then I get a person like, oh, so like one person said against him. We were up to 9 at my last check for how many people have come out with very specific and very detailed and many of them supported stories about him and what he's done. So do not argue with me on this. But since we've learned that, there are people going back and looking at some of his work and starting to read that information about him into his work. In specific, the one that comes up a lot is the story Calliope from the Sandman comic. Now, if you haven't read it, Calliope is a story in which the titular Greek muse is captured, held, and repeatedly raped because when the man who is holding her does that, it fires his creativity and brings him inspiration. So it is a story about a writer using a position of power to take advantage of a woman and using that to fuel his creativity. Folks have been reading a lot into that since the revelations about Gaiman came out, which again is fine. It practically demands a reevaluation in the wake of everything that's gone on. Where I draw a line, though, is when people do that and then go, we should have known he was like this because he wrote that story. Pump the frickin' brakes on that one. That is a dangerous line of thinking. And now we're going to talk about why. This notion of we should have been able to tell in advance because of this story very much leans into this entire idea that I'm trying to pull apart, of trying to read the artist from their art. And saying, oh, we should have known, brings an immediate implication that we should be looking into anyone who has ever written anything even close to that. And again, let's circle back to what we've already talked about. Writers will indulge all kinds of things for narrative reasons, for random flights of fancy, just because it's something that they wanted to explore. You don't have to be a monster to write monstrous things. Will there be some who are? Unfortunately, yes. But there'll also be some monsters who write things that are very much in line with the values you may hold to your heart. Having good values doesn't result in good art. Having bad values does not result in bad art. And having bad values doesn't mean your bad values are reflected in the work. And even if they are, you can't look at the work alone and make that leap. Many creators have dealt with ideas and characters and stories with similar themes to something like Calliope, who, to the best of our knowledge, have not done any of the things that Neil Gaiman has done. You are allowed to write whatever inspires you. The act of composing fiction in and of itself generally doesn't harm a bunch of people. Is it possible that you could push harmful ideas through fiction? Absolutely, different conversation. But the act of writing doesn't generate harm. And if we start looking to people's writing, assuming that they are an indicator of real-world harm, that is a very twisted, roundabout, moralistic way of imposing censorship. Oh, you can't ever write about something like that, because if you wrote about that, bet you've done it. Bet you get off on it. That's another very common assumption. Something that I had to unpack myself was I had casually in a video about a year and a bit ago made a reference to the idea that it struck me as odd that an asexual person would write a sexually charged piece of work. And I got rightfully taken to task on that. Because there are absolutely asexual people who still find it interesting, engaging, for whatever reason, whether it's an intellectual exercise or just a way to explore feelings that they themselves don't really have, will write romantic or erotic works. Being asexual doesn't mean you can't do that. Being a good person doesn't mean you can't write about horrible stuff. Writing horrible stuff doesn't mean you are a bad person. These things don't always connect, and even when they do, it has to be done from the direction of, we know this for certain about the creator, therefore we can say that this is how it influenced the work. You cannot take the work on its own and say that it means XYZ about the person who made it. You have to have information about them. Like, we can look at Ayn Rand, who I mentioned briefly, and look at the ideas in her work and know for a certainty that they reflected her real political ideas and her real philosophies because she told us that. So we can absolutely do it there, but it's because we know, because she told us. And if she had never made a political or philosophical statement in her life, but had just written the books and left it at that, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't. We could not accurately or safely say she definitely believes these things that she's writing about. Would it be possible? Yeah. And in her case, yeah, that was the case. But we know that because we know what she said she believed, and we can map that onto the work. When you just have the work, that cannot be mapped onto the creator who you don't know enough or indeed anything about. So that is something that I want people to keep in mind. And all of this, in a way, is going to tie into a future video that I want to do, this general idea that you cannot make an assumption that good people write good things or bad people write bad things. And by extension, you should not assume that a piece of work with good morals, and if you like that, but you don't like a piece of work with bad morals, that means that you have good morals, or that people that like that one with bad morals have bad morals. You can't assume that either. But again, that's something I'm going to tackle another time. But I just wanted to take the time to really dig in to this thing that I see people doing, oftentimes very casually. I think most don't realize when they do it. But it's something that I see. And it's something I wanted to push back at and give you stuff to keep in mind when engaging with the work of artists. Because when you make big sweeping assumptions about somebody based only off their creative or artistic works, you don't really have a leg to stand on. It's a creative work. Imagination went into it. As I said, there will always be some of the artist in the art. But that is not the only thing that's in there. And the times that it is, it's usually really obvious that it's pretty bad art. But even if you come across that in the wild, you still can't make that assumption about the artists unless you actually do some looking into them, see what they've said, and actually, then you can go, oh, you know, I suspected they might think that because this was in the book. And now I've looked into it, and yes, I did confirm that. Do the legwork. It's not like you will always be wrong if you make some statement about an artist based off the work, but if you're right, it's because you got lucky, not because you are somehow magically insightful. So just be careful. There we go. Thank you very much for joining me. As I said, this was something that just kind of, this is what my brain does. It spiraled into this entire thing that I wanted to talk about, and I don't know, this all felt like a little too much to put into a comment reply, so you're getting it here. But thank you for joining me. What are your thoughts on any or all of this? Are there examples that you have seen of people misusing this notion, or have there been times that you yourself have woken up to the idea of, oh, I made a bunch of assumptions about this creator based off this work, and that was not correct, or whatever else you think about anything I've said? Drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't help me out that way, like, share, subscribe. Those all help as well. Don't worry too much about it, though. And I'm going to voice over this last bit because I accidentally did the wrong sign-off. Please remember that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I am just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons. Robin Moore, Jared Boyce, Zubin Lutfulla, Auntie Kate 808, Mira G, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, Movie Turtle, Oliver B, Sean Miller, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Melissa Pedersen, Mary Mello, Becky Sparks, Loki Eris, Tracy Scrabbit, pal Barabajagal, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. Don't worry, the rats are all fine, but my rat wrangler is not here right now, and I thought we could have Archie say hi. Or not.